Over the years, we've seen a lot of people become interested, and a lot of Rabbanim begin to get interested in the Tekhelet. And we're particularly pleased that we have a guest with us today, Rabbi Halberstam from Lakewood, New Jersey. Rabbi Halberstam is a Posek, Rabbi of a community there in Lakewood. He is the author of a Sefer Chachma Nachala, which is a very unique approach in understanding Sefer. I forgot to write down Tekhelet. Thank you very much. And he is a man that obviously is looking for truth in MS, because he's come to look at Tekhelet in a slightly different way than most of his peers. And we're very, very pleased and honored that you're with us, and we ask you to please come up and speak.
Thank you. And I want to first thank my friend, Dr. Sturman, for inviting me. Thank the Marada Asra, the Billet, for your warm words, and the whole Kehillik Doisha for coming together for this fascinating event. We say by the davening, Talmidei Chachamim Marbim Sholom Ba'olam. And we all know that Talmidei Chachamim are always fighting. There's Milchamto Shel Torah. So what does it mean, Marbim Sholom Ba'olam? I once saw the Ramchal, Moshe Chaim Nitzate. He talks about sometimes we find sharp words in the Gemara from one Amoyre to the next. And he says that the Yiddish Neshama knows the Torah. The Yiddish Neshama is a part of the Rabbeinu Shalom. It doesn't need to be taught the Torah. So why is it that we sit down to learn and we don't know, and we struggle to know the emes? That's because of the extraneous parts that aren't rooted in the Torah that are attached to us. It comes from our character flaws, from the Yetzer Hara. It comes from some societal things which aren't rooted in the Torah. And when we come into this medrash, the goal is to try to do away with all of that baggage and to study the Torah. Ki heim chayenu, that's our very essence. The Torah is our essence, and we're studying ourselves. We're cleansing ourselves of those things which get in our way of knowing the Torah. So sometimes a person doesn't see which character flaws and which mistakes are stopping him from knowing the Gemara. And a friend can enlighten him, because his friend doesn't have the same issues exactly as he does. And therefore, it's not that they're fighting with one another, he says. They're joining one another to help each other in their fight against the Yetzer Hara, who's preventing them from connecting to the Rabbeinu Shalom. So when we come into this medrash, that's when we're all the same. That's when it's our common goal, Talmidei Chacham Marbim Sholom Ba'olam, because it's our goal. We all have the same goal. All we want is to know what the Rabbeinu Shalom is telling us to do. And I was zoiche to be very closely connected with one of the great poskim, my grandfather of Libes, Zichrono Livrocha, who was a posik still in Europe, and then he came here and he was a Rosh Bezdin and he wrote Shailas Tshuvas. And when I was 17, I was present when a delegation came to him from one of the big kehilis, which has many thousands of members. And they were inviting him to become their chief dayan. I wasn't privy to the conversation. I was a boy of 17. They had a discussion, but my grandfather refused. And I asked him why. So he said, when I sit down to deliberate over a shaila, there cannot be anything else besides the sources and the issues and whatever goes into the equation. But when a person is a chief rabbi of such a kehillah, sometimes there might be issues which might be heavy issues somehow connected to the kehillah or connected to a prominent member of the kehillah, and I might have the feeling somehow of pressure to sway in a particular direction, so it's not worth it. Because from my grandfather, all of the kavod and all of the money in the world wasn't worth to adulterate his psak and have anything that would maybe get in his way of seeking only the emes. So that's my glimpse into the mind of a Posek. And particularly when it comes to the issue of Tekhelet, it's a very difficult issue for many people, and many people have strong feelings about it. As we heard from Rav Billet, Shlita, people have a hard time changing. It's correct. We should have a hard time changing. Our Yiddishkeit is based on the Messiah, but it prevents us from being able to properly be done on this shaila. So the first point that I would like to make is that when you are done on the shaila, you have to do your very best to put all your biases aside. For me, change is it's not something I want to do. The Ramah brings from the Maharil in Hilchis Yom Kippur that the Chazan should not even change a nigun that the Kehal is used to singing, because it might confuse the people. And when we're talking about changing something as major as this, let me tell you something. Back in Lakewood, there's a quite a big to-do about it. I'll say that there is some confusion, and it's not something I want to do. But we have to put that aside. L'ma'anu emes. And I want to go through a couple of points. And the first point I want to go over is, why should we change? What is the value of this? Why is it so important that it's worth coming out and making such a prominent statement? Second of all, we already heard about the issue of Besoire from the Beis HaLevi. So how do we deal with that? Third of all, how is this different from the Radzina? A lot of people ask me, they say, listen, the Radzina, he was a tremendous Talmud Chacham. He wrote Sforim, not only on Tekhelet, tremendous Talmud Chacham. And later, many proved him wrong, apparently. I mean, there might be some people who still hold on to the idea that the Radzina Tekhelet is correct. I'm not going to get into the details of the discussion of that. But basically, the major consensus is that he was not correct. So now we come and we say, we think we discovered the Tekhelet. Do we think we're cleverer than the Radzina? Maybe in some later time we're going to be disproven. What is the difference between what we're doing and what the Radzina did? And what are our proofs that this is correct? The other question people ask me is, some of the things that we use to show that this is correct there is some archaeological evidence, which we might hear about, I believe, from Dr. Sturman. Is that something that's admissible into Bis Medrash? Do we paskin from archaeology? And finally, I want to discuss an issue that everybody knows. Chazal tell us the Tekhelet was nignaz. It was hidden away from us. And it seems it was hidden. It says, La'osid Lavoi probably refers to the times of Mashiach. Mashiach didn't come yet. The Bis Mikdash is not yet built. So it would seem that Chazal tell us we're not going to have it. So how could we think we have it? So let's go to the first point. The reason that we should embrace this topic to begin with is because it's a mitzvah. It says in the Torah, "Va'asu lohem tzitzis al kanfe bigdem l'doyroison." They should put on tzitzis. V'nasu al tzitzis hakonof psil Tekhelet. And just like there's a chiyuv to put tzitzis onto our talis, the same way there's a chiyuv, part of the mitzvah, one of the protei ha-mitzvah, is to put on Tekhelet. It's not optional, it's mandatory. And the Gemara tells us that if it's available to us and we don't put it on, there's an oynish. Just like there's an oynish for somebody who doesn't put on tzitzis altogether. The Gemara actually says that when it comes to a kiyum of a mitzvah saseh, makin oisoi ad shetetzei nafshoi. If a person refuses to be mekayim a mitzvah, we force him to be mekayim the mitzvah. The Shagas Aryeh asks a kasha. In his time, obviously, there was no idea of putting on Tekhelet. So he asks a kasha, why do we wear a talis? We put on a talis, we're creating a problem for ourselves. If we wouldn't wear a talis, then there would be no chiyuv to have tzitzis. But now that we have a talis, so we put on the tzitzis of Lavan, the white strings, and we don't have the Tekhelet. So if we don't have what's needed, let's not put on a talis. Like if somebody doesn't have tzitzis and he has a talis that doesn't have tzitzis, he wouldn't put it on. So why should we wear a talis? So he says that no, it's different because it's an oinus. We don't have Tekhelet. And the chiyuv of putting on Tekhelet only begins after we're already wearing the talis. So when it comes to wearing a talis, which we do because it's a mitzvah, because the lavon, the white strings in and of itself is also a mitzvah, even if we can't have the Tekhelet, it's not ma'akiv. So therefore, we put on the talis. But you see from his words clearly that when it is available, not to have it would be the same as wearing a talis without tzitzis. And on the other hand, supposing that we rule that it is Tekhelet, and we end up to be wrong. We have the Yeshua's Malkar, Yeshua Kutner, who talks about the Tekhelet of the Radzina, and he vehemently disagrees. He says that the proofs that the Radzina says are only guesses. There's nothing conclusive there to really prove it. But he says that if somebody put it onto his talis, it's not a problem. Lo yehei ela lavon. So it's as though it's regular tzitzis. The dye is loy ma'alev and loy moired. So that's why, if people say that there is Tekhelet, and when I was first approached about this, it was somewhat shocking, and the knee-jerk reaction that everyone has is, Tekhelet sounds like a far-out idea. We all know we don't have Tekhelet. But I was presented this by people for whom I have respect. And therefore I looked into it. And since there are lots of Talmidei Chachamim who are saying that there is something to it, it's not something that we should ignore. And that's the reason that I looked into it and I was done on this subject. Now in connection to the Shaila of Mesorah, we heard the version of the Beis HaLevi that says we cannot do something without a Mesorah. We cannot be Mekayim a mitzvah that we do not have a direct tradition to be Mekayim. Let me first explain how this Tekhelet is different than the Radzina Tekhelet. And there's a very yesoidistic difference between the two. The Radzina saw certain simonim that the Gemara gives, and he tried to interpret those simonim, and he decided that the cuttlefish, the inkfish, meets those requirements and is correct. It matches the simonim. However, the simonim could be interpreted in many different ways. One of the things he says, the Gemara says that gufoi doime liyom, the body of the chalozon, which the chalozon is the name of the sea creature that's the source of Tekhelet, it's similar, it resembles the sea. So Rashi says its appearance, mare hayom, its appearance resembles the sea. Obviously this is open to interpretation, but the Radzina interpreted it that means that it's blue. So he said the cuttlefish is blue. I don't know that the cuttlefish is blue, but he says the cuttlefish is blue. And obviously if someone would say that if there are many other fish in the sea that are blue, and maybe we can interpret this differently, so that's the objection of the Yeshua's Malka, that it's nothing but a guess. And that's why most of the Yedolim in his time didn't accept this Tekhelet. There is a difference between identifying something through simonim and identifying something through a direct identification. And let me give you a mashal. The Rambam tells us that by Matan Torah it says, Ba'avir yishma ho'om v'dabri imoch v'gam b'cho yamin el-olam. After this Ma'amad Har Sinai, everybody will believe in the Rebbeinu Shel Olam and they'll believe in Moshe. So the Rambam says, we already had things which It says by Kriyas Yamsif, Vayaminu B'Hashem v'Moshe Avdoi. The Rambam says there's a difference. He says that when we know something through a proof, through a moifis sichli, that still leaves room for a person to doubt it, even if it's a correct proof and it's a conclusive proof. But people don't see it that way. However, what is it? The person says, Kriyas Yamsif, how could that happen? There must be Rabbeinu Shalom. I don't know. But maybe a person could start thinking, maybe there's kishuf, maybe some sort of witchcraft, maybe some sort of a natural event, who knows? Person thinks, I don't know everything, I don't know how everything works. But by Ma'amad Har Sinai, we saw with our own eyes and we heard with our own ears, the Rabbeinu Shalom called out Moshe, and we experienced it. We were present and we experienced the Rabbeinu Shalom himself. So that was clear. It wasn't through proofs. It wasn't from the side. It was direct. So, to give a practical example, if we would have a gathering with 50,000 people and somebody would say, can you call out this particular individual, let me describe him to you, he's tall and he has dark hair and he has a fair complexion, etc. Gives him some simonim. And the person goes in, he looks around, he finds somebody and he calls him out. Say, there might be a chance that he gets it right, but I would say there's also a big chance that he gets it wrong, because there are probably 200 people there who fit these descriptions, and he might not have understood maybe what he considers a fair complexion is not what he considers a... But if somebody says, you know Mr. So-and-so, can you call him out? Or, do you know the person, if there's a person sitting in row G, seat 17, call him out. You've directly identified who you're talking about. There's no question that you're going to get it right. The way today we have identified the Murex trunculus as being the source of Tekhelet is because the Gemara gives one requirement for Tekhelet, and that is that it should be from something called chalazon. So in Europe it wasn't known what chalazon is, but we find many sources, if we do some research, which tell us from the Rishonim and from Chazal. I'm not going to get into them specifically, but the word chalazon means a snail, as it does, by the way, in Arabic to this very day. Halazon means a snail. But we find many sources showing that. From Chazal, the Bach, Schneck, which is Yiddish for snail. And snail is a general term of the species which has many different types of snails. And any snail which is in that category is a chalazon. And therefore, since that's the only requirement, and it does produce this dye, so that's it. Who needs anything more? But there is more. And that's the fact that historically we find that this murex was used in the times of Chazal and over the generations to dye Tekhelet. We find it because the Gemara tells us that in the northwest of Eretz Yisrael, from Tzor until Haifa, where today is Lebanon, until Haifa, at the coast, that's where they trap the chalazon. And that's exactly where we find it today. And that's where the coins that were minted in that Malchus of Tzor, of Tyre, depict the image of the Murex trunculus, also the Murex brandaris, both Murexes, which were used to dye. But we see clearly that these chalazons were used in the times of Chazal to dye just around the corner in Eretz Yisrael. And it's a chalazon. And if that's not enough, so we have Gedolei Olam, who actually said clearly that the purpura, the murex, is the source of Tekhelet. Rabbi Yankiv Emden says so. By the way, Rabbi Yankiv Emden, he quotes the history books. He says he takes it from there, amongst other sources. We have Rab Shamshon Fol Hirsch. We have the Chavos Yoyer. and others, who clearly identify the murex as the source of Tcheles. So, to get back to the shaila of Mesoira, when we need to identify something through simonim, so the simonim are very vague, and they lend themselves to interpretation. And unless we know specifically what the Gemara is telling us, especially these simonim that the Gemara says, it doesn't even seem that the Gemara is trying to identify the chalazon, because the simonim are not spoken in that context, and they're not very specific. One of the simonim that says there is that it emerges from the sea once in 70 years. And the Gemara says the reason I'm telling you that is to explain why it's so expensive. So it's clearly not given as a source of identity. So for that, in order to clearly know that what we found is what Chazal are telling us, how could we know? We can only guess. So we need a Messiah. But if we have something which is pinpointing directly, I don't know if the Beis Halevi would have objected to that. And I'm not going to get into an arichas, but it seems to me that from the halachas of oifis, which need a Messiah to be kosher, it seems to me from there that such a thing would be considered a Messiah. The issue of Messiah is that we cannot identify something by simonim. But if we're identifying it by direct identification, because it's been documented, or because we have other things which point to it directly, not by description, which could be vague, that would probably constitute a Messiah. Besides which, there's no downside. So where we're talking about Messiah by oifis, if a person would be wrong, that's where we find this application in halacha. If a person will be wrong, he'll end up eating something that isn't kosher. And there's no need to eat it. Over here it's the exact opposite. If he's wrong, there's no harm done. And there is a need to put it on, because if it's correct, there's a chiv gomer. So then they ask, what types of evidence are admissible into this medrash? Is archaeology admissible into this medrash? So that's not the only thing, I already said. But the answer is, you don't take anybody's word for anything. Even when somebody comes out with a kuntris, with a pamphlet, where he comes out with either a new kula or a new chumrah, and he quotes in certain sources, and you have to look everything up. You have to research everything yourself. If you're a Rav, you can't take anybody's word for anything. And I did that. I had lengthy correspondence with professors of chemistry, with professors of language, in connection to the Chalazon. Besides the fact that I've gone through every single source that I thought was important on my own, until I myself was convinced. And I'm thinking maybe this might explain why some of the elder Rabbonim didn't and don't embrace it, because some of the things that I had to do for this research are not things that some of the elder Rabbonim could do. There's even quoted Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach as having said, "Man muss sein younger," in connection to this. You got to be younger to be able to be done and to paskin on this particular shaila. So then you have the other thing, what do the opponents say? Because as much as you think you could rely on your own judgment, al ta'amin ba'atzmacha, and I heard shiurim from some of the people who are against it, and from I've seen some things written, and I must say, because that's the purpose of what we've gotten together here for, in my humble opinion, I did not see anything of merit that would discredit this murex trunculus as being the source of Tekhelet. And it seems to me that they violated rule number 1, which was to leave the baggage outside of Bismedish. Because some of the things that they say seem that they had a strong feeling to discredit it, and that came before everything else. And it may be colored, if I may use that term, their judgment in this matter. And finally, I want to discuss the issue of nignaz. We know that Chazal tell us that it's been hidden away. So let's take a look at Chazal. There's a Sifri in Parshas Zos HaBracha, and it says that Rabbi Yossi met an old man and asked him, "What is the source of your livelihood? What is your panas?" So he said, "Chalozon." He said, "Imi motzuihu? Is chalozon available?" So he said, "Yes, there's a place in the sea, biyom hamutel bein haharim. It's situated among the mountains." Whatever that means, the sea, hamutel bein haharim. And that's where we could find the murex. But if you try to get it, samomios, makifos, there's a creature which is a venomous creature, either some sort of a spider or a serpent, which will sting and kill whoever tries to get it. So Rabbi Yossi said, apparently it's nignaz, it's hidden away for the tzaddikim, la'osad lovay. So it seems it's nignaz. But the Mefarshim ask a kasha, because this was written in the times of the Tanoim. And about 4.5 centuries later, the Tekhelet was still around, because it was around through the entire era of the Amoraim until the Rabbanon Savoiroi. So obviously it wasn't nignaz. So there are several explanations. David Pardoy says that there are two types. There's the finer type of halazon, which is hidden for the tzaddikim, but the other type that we all used for tzitzis is still around. If I may offer my own interpretation of the Sifri, and that is, it occurred to me that probably it's spoken b'derech mashal, because it seems, first of all, a contradiction. First he said it's his livelihood, and then we said that it's not available. It's l'tzadikim l'osid lavoi. So it occurred to me, b'siyata d'shmaya, that Samomis probably is a kini. It's probably a nickname for Malchus Roimi. So I looked it up, and I found that it's so. Several midrashim say that Samomis means Malchus Edom. And then I figured that Horim probably means kingdoms. And we find that in the Medrash too. And actually it says in Tilim, B'moit Horim B'lev Yamim, Shemitzuda says it refers to the kingdoms in Milchemes Gog u'Magog. So the interpretation of the Sifri is clear. It's his livelihood. Obviously, it was being produced for the royalty, but it's not available. Umi motzuihu? No, it's not available, because it's in the sea, but it's amongst the harem, it's amongst the kingdoms, and if someone tries to get it, he'll be stung by Malchus Roimi, because it was punishable by death. And me'inyan le'inyan, I thought I could interpret maybe what Chazal tell us, that it emerges from the sea once in 70 years, also in a similar way, because we know that Chazal sometimes allude to the fact that there was a gzeira, there was a decree against the Tekhelet, because they don't want to say that we're doing something and we're trying to get it when it's against the law. So we find actually another Gemara which shows that. And I see that the Gemara says because it emerges once in 70 years, that's why it's expensive. And I don't understand why it should be expensive. We don't need it to emerge from the sea. The Gemara tells us that it was trapped with nets in the sea like any other fisheries. So I was thinking, 70 years, where do we have a Chazal about 70 years? And I remember the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, Siyata Dishmaya, which tells us that the Romans had an event once in 70 years where they took someone who represents Yaakov, someone who limps, because it says when he was hit on the thigh by the Malach, and someone who is healthy, and they take the complete person, rides on the limping person to show that Esav is on top of Yaakov. And without getting into the detail of the Gemara, it tells us that they said at the end of the event, whoever sees this now sees it, and whoever doesn't, doesn't. And that means because it's not going to happen again in our lifetime. It's once in 70 years. And the Gemara describes the amount of wealth that went into this event. So my understanding is that this was a Roman event, and it was the event of a lifetime, and everyone probably came in their finest. And at that time, and in preparation for this event, there were probably lots of chalzoinis being trapped, and a lot of textiles being produced with a royal color. And at that time, it was probably more available and easy to obtain than any other time. And that's what the Gemara means. Now, I'm not as sure about this as I am about the Sifri, but I think it's a possible interpretation, at least so much so that we could say that when the Gemara gives simonim, we can't conclude one thing or the other. And I'll be Messiah with a Dvar Agoda, a vote that I heard from my son, a Bocher Talmud Chacham Shloime. He asked the Kasha, he said that we know that the Golus that we're in now is called Golus Edom, because the Romans destroyed the second Beis Hamikdash and it hasn't been rebuilt yet. And Chazal tell us that there are 10 kingdoms in the world. The 8th kingdom is Malchus Edom. The 9th kingdom is the Melech HaMashiach. The 10th is the same as the first, the Rabbeinu Shalom. So, where are we now? The Roman Empire has fallen. Mashiach didn't come yet. It says, Kishazeh kom zeh noifel. When this one, Esav and Yaakov, when one rises, the other falls. So they have fallen, we haven't risen. What's going on? So my son said, yes, it's true that the Roman Empire fell, but their decree is still in force. Because they decreed against Tekhelet, and it became Nignaz, and it wasn't available. And even now that it is available, people are still holding on to Nignaz, the decree of Malchus Edom. So as long as their decree is enforced, they haven't completely fallen yet. So the Makeh B'Patish, the final blow against them would be when we do away with Nignaz, and we embrace and we're Mekayim the mitzvah of Tekhelet, and then maybe we're ready for the next kingdom of the Melech HaMashiach b'mheira yameinu. Thanks for listening.